Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking. Today we're discussing 2020's Booker Prize winner, Shuggie Bain, by Glaswegian author Douglas Stuart. It takes the subject of alcoholism and a broken family as its theme, but was rejected by 44 publishers as too meandering and bleak before Grove Atlantic took a chance on it.
Its success in winning the Booker Prize more than justified their faith in it. But is Shuggie Bain more than just misery lit? To decide, we're joined once again by one of our favourite people to have on the show, journalist and friend Phil Chaffee.
Regular listeners may remember Phil appeared on our Booker Prize show, where he correctly tipped Shuggie Bain to win. Now, 4 months on, does Shuggie still have a place in his heart? And what did my book club make of it? Keep listening to find out. It's so nice to have you back, Phil. Did you reread Shuggie, or are we still going on your first impressions?
I reread the beginning and the end, and then I picked around a tiny bit in the middle, but mainly we're going on my first impressions. I was curious, if I opened the book again, how enticed would I be to keep going? And I was still pretty enticed.
Yeah, that is the big question, isn't it? I did think I would reread it for the show. But I have to say, I procrastinated like anything about picking it up, even though I've read it and I know it's great. And Laura, you did manage to read some of it, didn't you, when we talked about it before?
I have done better than on the Booker Prize episodes, where I had only read the first 60 pages. I have now read the first 60 pages and the last 100 pages. But just as an anecdote to justify my wayward ways, I picked it up on this past weekend and was complaining to my husband, and he left the room. He came back and he was like, "You look like you're in physical pain." I was reading about a particularly traumatic moment in a taxi cab, and I just thought, yes, I am in physical pain. That's what this book does to you. Maybe you guys are just braver than me.
Well, I think it's interesting and we should come on to this, but what Phil and I know that you don't know is that there's a sort of upbeat midsection.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wait, okay, so you get your hopes up.
That may even be crucial to one's ability to sustain reading the whole thing and also appreciation of it overall. For anyone who hasn't read it or doesn't know about it, do you want to just tell us about the plot?
Shuggie Bain is set in Glasgow in the 1980s and early 1990s. It's a city in the midst of recession, and working families are struggling to survive. Agnes Bain has always expected more from life. She dreams of greater things, a house with its own front door, and a life bought and paid for outright, like her perfect but false teeth. But Agnes is abandoned by her philandering husband, and soon she and her 3 children find themselves trapped in a decimated mining town. As she descends deeper into drink, the children try their best to save her, yet one by one they must abandon her to save themselves. It is her youngest son, Shuggie, who holds out hope the longest. Shuggie Bain is the story of a Glasgow childhood and the relationship between an alcoholic mother and her son. More generally, it's about working-class Glasgow, a society devastated by Thatcher's policies and struggling to make ends meet. The Booker judges said, "We were bowled over by this first novel, which creates an amazingly intimate, compassionate, gripping portrait of addiction, courage, and love." I had forgotten that it was his first novel.
Oh, yeah. I think that's a big part of why, well, certainly I was so impressed by it. I don't know about you, Phil. I think you had the same reaction, didn't you? Like a debut?
Absolutely.
One of the things that came up the last time we podcasted on Shuggie Bain is the vexed question of the pronunciation of Shuggie. At the time, I had heard a couple of people talking about it who had said Shuggie, and I hadn't questioned it. I just thought, oh, yeah. Although it's true that that's not the way I said it in my head when I read the book. And so I got everyone to say Shuggie. I then, after we'd done the podcast, listened to author Douglas Stuart talking about it. To my horror, he said Shuggie. And I was like, oh no. And then I was thinking, oh, well, that's silly. You know, we should have said Shuggie, but we couldn't change it. Nothing could be done. It's fine. And then I heard my friend Laura, who has recently joined or rejoined my book club. She was in it once a long time ago and has recently come back to us brilliantly now that we're doing things over Zoom. It's possible again. I'm welcoming in old friends from around the globe. She is from Glasgow, and she, interestingly, said Shuggie.
Is it strange that I just think you're saying the same thing every time? Do you think maybe it's just the Glaswegian accent that you can't quite recreate? It's like, it's not Shuggie, Shuggie.
You say Shuggie and I say
Yeah, I
Shuggie.
think it's actually maybe in between, and it's the Scottish thing that we're not recreating. I don't know.
And then
I
on
think
that
so.
point, I thought, because it's going to be just excruciating if I, with my Southern England BBC accent, try to read any of this book aloud, I will use a bit from the audiobook, which is read by Angus King. And he, interestingly, pronounces it somewhere between the two. Have a listen. This clip is from the beginning of the book. We meet Shuggie for the first time, and he's a 15-year-old. He's living on his own. He's lying about his age, and he's working in this supermarket, Kilfeathers.
He'd worked for Kilfeathers for over a year. It was never meant to be that long. It was just that he had to feed himself and pay his own dig money each week. And the supermarket was the only business that would take him. Mr. Kilfeather was a parsimonious bastard. He liked to staff the shop with anyone he didn't have to pay a full adult wage. And Shuggie found himself able to take short shifts that fit around his patchy schooling. In his dreams, he always intended to move on. He had always loved to brush and play with hair. It was the only thing that made time truly fly. When he had turned 16, he had promised himself he would go to the hairdressing college that sat south of the River Clyde. He had gathered up all of his inspiration, the sketches he had copied from the Littlewoods catalogue and pages ripped from the Sunday magazines. Then he had gone to Cardonald to see about the evening classes. At the bus stop outside the college, he alighted with half a dozen 18-year-olds. They wore the newest, most fashionable gear and talked with a buzzing confidence that masked their own nerves. Shuggie walked half as fast as they did. He watched them go in the front door, then he recrossed the street to catch the bus going the other way. He started at Kilfeathers the following week.
And so from almost the very beginning of the book, the first thing we know about this character is this sort of disappointment. There's this sense of nothing is ever going to work out, that somehow dreams are not for him and that he doesn't get to choose the life he leads.
Did you find that sense of desolation was altered by the fact that we know this is a semi-autobiographical novel, and we know that Douglas Stuart had a very traumatic childhood and an alcoholic mother? And of course, he has gone on to have a successful career in fashion design and win the Booker Prize, and you have the sense achieve some measure of happiness and healing after this childhood. And so for me, although the book is very depressing and this opening is bleak, this abandoned child, he's only 15 years old, living in a horrible boarding house with predatory men, and yet, because it's also Douglas Stuart's story to a certain extent, for me there was hope there that somehow Shuggie was going to be able to rise above this.
Yeah, I definitely think that. And I've actually been thinking a lot, Laura, about why you find this so bleak and so difficult to read. And I find it not difficult to read and so compelling. And I think I would find it more difficult, much more, if this book were called Agnes Bain, and if it were just a book following his mother's addiction and that trauma. But I think framing it around Shuggie, and not just Shuggie, but also the other siblings, and there's one or two other friends who you have this sense that they are not going to follow in their mother's footsteps and they are pushing to get out of this. And that adds this sort of positive quality, which made it a lot more compelling to me, I think.
Yeah, I was thinking about Shuggie's siblings. So he has an older brother and sister who are Agnes's first husband's children. She then leaves the first husband, who was Catholic, and he was a fairly good, decent man, a real rarity in this book. But unfortunately, for Agnes, who was dreaming of excitement, I think, and wanted more from life, he wasn't enough. And then she meets Big Shug, this taxi driver, who seems to offer, I think, this one of the recurring images in this book or motifs is these taxi drivers endlessly circling the city. He somehow represents a kind of freedom, I think, an ability to move where people can't go that makes him this seemingly quite attractive proposition. And Agnes certainly is just sort of smitten by this. And so she leaves the safe, comfortable first husband, takes the children. It then skips 10 years and we re-encounter her living with her parents. And by this time she's had Shuggie, who's then, 6 or 7, I think, when these memories start. But so the two older siblings, there's actually the brother, Leek, who is a really interesting character, I think. He is quiet. He's got this ability to escape inwardly, and he's artistic, and he draws and he dreams. And I always, because the little I knew about Douglas Stuart, I knew that he was a fashion designer, and I knew that he lived in New York. And for me, I felt like the Bleak character was him and not necessarily Shuggie. And I think that really helped me. That stopped me from finding it too devastating, because I knew Douglas Stuart had escaped, that his life had gone on to be more than this life and this childhood. Of course, we don't know how much of it is autobiographical, do we? We know that there are certain elements. But one of the big questions in my mind was how much of it was exaggerated for literary effect, which is why I think you hear people kind of dismissing it as misery lit.
Have you come across people saying that?
There's an interesting couple of reviews I found online that I think give the sense of the polar opposite reactions to this book. X70Dev gave it 5 out of 5 stars. He said it was brutally brilliant. Some books never leave you. Once read, they sit in the background of your mind, resurfacing whenever life confronts you with the story's subject matter. In the same vein as Yanagihara's A Little Life, also shortlisted for the Booker Prize, Shuggie Bain is brutal to the point of having to put the book down at times. This is not a light or easy read. It's a journey into the lives of people broken by their circumstances and upbringing, yet filled with unfiltered love. You will cry with sadness, anger and despair. I lived just outside Glasgow at the end of the time in which this book was set. My ex-wife was equal to Shuggie's mother, Agnes, in her descent into alcoholism, and I have children who lived through her worst excesses. No other book or film I have seen or read has portrayed alcoholism more accurately than this one. It is stark, it is painful to witness, it is reality. My time in Scotland helped me hugely with this book. I'm sure many will struggle with the language and vocabulary used. In an interview, the author said that both he and the publishers, for reasons of authenticity, wanted to keep the Glaswegian slang and vocabulary. This book is not just the story of the child and his alcoholic mother. It is a documentary of the poverty and deprivation in Glasgow of the 1980s. It's a page-turner, and it's beautifully crafted by the author. A book that could and should win the Man Booker, and indeed it did. It is a future classic. Read this book, but pick your time, because it will affect you.
Mm.
But then, Michael weighs in, gives it 1 star. Spoiled by cliched nonsense. This depressing book would put people off ever going to Glasgow, even me, and I've lived here all my life. It's full of stereotypical nonsense and makes me think the 5-star reviewers are jumping on the Booker bandwagon. A town full of men who start drinking on Fridays, payday, and don't return to their wives and kids until Sunday, blitz drunk. Nurses who routinely pull broken bottles from ribs on Saturday nights. Women repeatedly get their hair ripped out of their heads. A father who beats his 35-year-old daughter with the mother looking on in some sort of biblical ritual which is portrayed in That's Life manner. Local town, Pithead, is something out of Star Trek with its skull-headed women who rip their clothes off in the street. There are no nice characters in this story. It's also full of inaccuracies and clunky Americanisms. For example, grifting instead of conning. As for all the riveters in Gavin and bamming you up, I think the writer's got his eras mixed up. Who can fathom what that means? But then the reason I pull this one out is he says, apart from the cliches and credibility issues, the descriptive narrative is among the best I've read. It's excellent.
I'm really glad that you picked out 2 reviews from Glaswegians, because I worry about the validity of my views when it comes to a book like this, because I don't have the depth of knowledge of the culture and the lives. And so I question whether I have any right to say, ooh, is this misery lit, right? You know, if this is reality, this is reality. And my questioning, it comes from a position of privilege. It was so great to hear 2 very different views from people with lived experience of Glasgow.
Yeah, I think even they're divided over it. Laura Thompson from my book club has sent me some comments, which I'm going to play at the end, I think, for anyone who wants to listen. Partly, it's just wonderful to hear her Glasgow accent. But she did comment on the depiction of Glasgow as a city, the way it's like a character in the book. She talked about Pithead. It is apparently just this lost zone, far beyond the city limits. And there's this sense in the book, isn't there, of almost a place that's quite cut off. There's a train that goes from Glasgow to Edinburgh that goes through this landscape, but there's not a sense of them being connected to the city or really connected to anything nice. They're just out there by these huge coal slag heaps, and everything is covered in dust, and it just really all sounds so miserable. There are so many things about this book that are so relentlessly awful. It almost is funny, although it's all done with quite a light touch, I think. One of the things is the neighbours. Big Shug takes Agnes and the kids out to this house that he's wangled from a friend of a friend. He's managed to get this place for practically nothing. He promises her it's going to be the start of a new life together. She's excited. They go out, they drive past all these lovely houses with beautiful, neat gardens. She thinks it's the beginning of a new life. And then they get to this place that is just so awful. And then the neighbours crowd in. And they're like this Greek chorus. It's like they echo everything back, but it's magnified 10 times. It's all sort of worse. And I found myself questioning that community, thinking, would they really have all been so terrible to one another? I couldn't quite believe there wouldn't have been more of a sense of solidarity and them looking out for each other. I don't know. What do you think?
It felt true to me as I was reading it, but I'm not entirely sure how relevant it is to think about Glaswegians responding to it. I was thinking about this last week, walking by a church I live right next to, where there was just this epic queue around the block. I mean, hundreds of people queuing for food. That is the London I live in, but we all live in such different lives right next to each other. And given that both of those reviewers that you cited can be completely true, I mean, can live in completely different Glasgows.
Yeah, I did think of that. The second one could be from a happy middle-class family, and he resents this portrait of a world that exists, but he doesn't encounter.
Yeah, or even from a very poor family, but just in a different experience. It seemed completely plausible to me, I would say.
One of my favorite books in recent years, because of the impact it had on me, was Poverty Safari, Understanding the Anger of Britain's Underclass by Darren McGarvey. Darren McGarvey is about my age. I think he's about 34, 35 now. And he grew up in Glasgow. He was the son of an alcoholic mother who eventually died, I think, in her early 30s. And he himself suffered with addiction and alcoholism, but was able to pull himself out of it in his 20s, helped by the fact that, unlike Shuggie Bain, he had a very stable and loving father. I'll talk about this book in a bit when we get to our recommendations, but one of the things he talks about is how violence begets violence. And I think that comes through in Shuggie Bain, is that, you know, even Big Shug, we know that he was abused as a child. And then there's the physical abuse that he rains down on Agnes. And the children, in the end, when they're stabbing knives through the mailbox at Shuggie Bain's door, right? And you think, how could this be? And yet, if you're surrounded by that level of violence, it just becomes normalized. I think it probably is believable. Not that that's a measure of a book's worth, but in terms of our own interaction with it.
That's very explicit in the book. I was just reading earlier, there's a bit where Shuggie is being bullied by a kid in the playground. And the way that the physical interaction takes place is described very vividly, where the boy reaches out as if to slap Shuggie on one side of his face. And as he pulls away, what's coming that he hasn't realised is a fist on the other side. And the boy goes, there's a name for that. I can't remember what it was, but, you know, he says the name of this thing. He's like, my dad taught me that. And it's such a little thing. It's a few lines, but it tells you so much about exactly what you were just saying. These cycles of violence being passed down from generation to generation.
Darren McGarvey talks about when he was bullied in the school playground and went home and complained to his mother, she marched him back to fight and to hold his own. You know, that pride associated with it. I can't comprehend it, but there's a code of honor that was hand in hand with this violence. But Kate, what did your book club think? You teased to me over text that not everyone got through it, which made me feel marginally better.
I don't think anyone like you started it and then wasn't able to finish it. I think the people who got going with it then did fly through it. When you've got that little book club incentive, I don't know, that sometimes pushes you. And I do think very much with this book, especially rereading it, I was much more conscious of it. The awfulness does build, and it does get to a point where it starts to feel relentless and grueling. And there are these incredibly vivid scenes. There's one I was reading earlier where every so often Agnes tries to have a day or a few days where she won't drink. And what happens is these neighbours who want to keep her in this web of alcohol, there's a kind of complicity among them that no one should be able to break free of this. And so they come round and this awful neighbour Ginty comes. And then there's a whole really excruciating scene to do with the fact that Ginty just wants alcohol. She invites this man over. Agnes actually has been raped by a man the night before. Ginty then engineers the situation so that in return for this man bringing alcohol, Agnes will then sexually interact with this man that she's invited. It's awful. And at that point, I was thinking, there's a point where it almost starts to feel like too much. And then the tone shifts. And then there is this period where Agnes finally goes and she finds an AA meeting. And then there is this section about that transformation. And I thought one of the reasons that that's so powerful is because he's taken you down the path of how awful it all is, so that you know it so well that then when there is this break and this change, what I found is that that really changed the way I was identifying with Agnes as a character. One of the things that came up for my book club was she really makes some appalling decisions as a mother. People were angry with her for that. She has these 3 children. She's very selfish. One way of looking at her is that she only cares about herself and her own happiness. And people were a bit judgmental about that. But as I was reading it again, I was thinking, what gradually he shows you is, yes, she makes some terrible choices and some bad decisions. But look at the web that she is caught in. She's enmeshed at every turn by things that fight to hold her in this terrible place. And I suppose as a human being, you think, I don't know if I'd have the strength to break out of that. And that's where I think the empathy comes. Part of his genius is allowing you to see that. So that even though this is a character who's completely alien to me, nonetheless, you find yourself really walking in her shoes. And you see what he loves about her. You see her glamour and her pride and her refusal to be beaten down despite everything. Some part of her will never submit. And you can't help but admire that. So, I suppose what I'm trying to get at is, why read this awful book? I mean, what is it about it that's special and magical and is the reason to read it and to engage with it? I think it is the way that he takes you on this journey with her. He strips everything away, and what you're left with is this bright, pure thing, which is this thread of love between her and Shuggie. Laura's looking unconvinced.
Actually, there's another point I want to make, a tangent, but I was just thinking of different perspectives. Rather than thinking about the verisimilitude and how real this is, there was this amazing review written by James Walden in the New York Review of Books of Shuggie Bain, where he sort of contextualizes it in Scottish literature. And he talks about these 2 poles of Scottish literature going back into the Victorian era, where there was this Kailyard literature. It sounds like saccharine, treacly, good, honest working folk all working together. And then separately, there was a reaction to that. And he pinpoints this 1901 novel, which is very bleak, briar patch literature. And then he talks about this book that the BBC, when they polled Scottish people, came up as their favorite novel, called Sunset Song. Do you know this?
Mm-mm.
And that book was very deliberately written, it even says it in the opening, between a Kailyard and a briar patch, and a bonny briar patch, but very much maneuvering between this very bleak depiction and this other. And I guess James Walden's point is that Shuggie Bain is doing the same thing and sort of navigating very intentionally between these different ways of depicting, I guess in this case, rural Scotland. I've tried to read Sunset Song and found the language pretty incomprehensible. So I didn't make it that far. But as a way of thinking about Shuggie, rather than is this true to life or not, but sort of where is he maneuvering this in terms of literary history, it's one interesting take.
I think that was my problem, is that I had very little patience with Agnes at certain moments, I should flag. So the real clincher for me that made me throw the book away in the beginning was this episode where they're still living with her parents and Shug has gone off with other women and hasn't come home, and she burns the curtains in her room. Okay, fine. But she holds Shuggie to her chest during this.
Yep.
And they only survive, they only don't die from smoke inhalation because her father or mother runs in and puts out the fire. And I just thought, what? I don't, I can understand all sorts of behavior and have empathy for that experience. But to kill your child that way, that's where I stopped. And then, of course, I went back. I don't know, it seemed too much.
I mean, that's part of why it's so clever, is because she's not likable or someone that you expect to empathize with at all in the first part of the book. And it just creeps up on you.
Is it because of Shuggie's love for her?
It's a lot of things, isn't it? I think that's definitely an important thing, the way that he sees her. And you do get a sense of the glamour of her. And as I said, her spirit. that you can't help but admire. That becomes something that you kind of hold on to. There's a thing, isn't there? I think I've read that his sort of inspiration in his mind's eye was this idea of Elizabeth Taylor. There's something of the glamour of Elizabeth Taylor, or maybe it's referenced in the book, I don't know, but she's got a mink coat. You mentioned her parents. When she was little, she had a happy childhood, as you say, and she was very spoiled by her father. I mean, they didn't have a lot of money, but what he did have, he spent on her. So she's someone who's used to the best and used to having love and used to having good things. And when you contrast that with where she ends up, you sort of understand, in a way, some of her inner devastation, as well as her incredulity. It's like she can never quite believe this has happened to her.
I would also say, going back to that one reader's comments about this is a depiction of alcoholism, you do really understand alcoholism as a disease. And Agnes, when she's not on the drink, and then they talk about this is the drink speaking, and it's really tangible. And the framing of this book starts with Shuggie when he's older, and you know he doesn't have a mother. So a lot of the framing of the book is how exactly is Agnes going to disappear from Shuggie's life. But I think there's this other mystery in the book, which I don't know if you got to this part, Laura. It jumps back a generation to Agnes's childhood and her parents. And you get this crazy sort of original sin going on with the parents, which they don't really return to, but it is a jaw-dropping moment in the book, and it's really hard to figure out. I just remember just stopping. I was so astonished. I'm curious what you made of that, Kate. It sounds like you did not make it there, Laura.
No. I'm curious.
I agree. When I first read the book, it gets to this moment. We can't talk about it, can we not? Is it too spoilery?
It's a bit spoilery.
Yeah. It gets to this moment. Agnes's father has been away. He's been fighting in the war. And his mother doesn't know if he's going to come back. She doesn't think he is going to come back, actually. Like many men, she thinks he's not going to come back. She's forced to do what she needs to do to survive, to get money and to get food. And then he does come back. And there's this reunion between two people that we're given to understand really love each other very, very deeply and intensely. And then, as Phil says, there's just a page where something happens. It's dealt with very quietly and very matter-of-factly, but it is utterly cataclysmic. And at the time, I paused over it. I was like, really? And then kind of carried on, like, what did I just read there? But the narrative kind of propels you on, so I didn't dwell on it. This time, when I went back through it and got to that part again, I was like, oh my goodness, yes, that is what happened. I didn't dream that. And again, I suppose it comes back to this sense of these people's lives, and is this again like the things that they're driven to do by necessity because of poverty? And I haven't talked about one of the other things that comes up in this book is sectarianism, which really surprised me when I first was reading it. I don't associate Protestantism and Catholicism as a sort of divisive force with Scotland. I just associate that with Ireland. That's sort of what I feel like I know about. But it turns out, according to this book, it's sort of serious and important issue there. So people are divided along these religious lines as well. And that really affects the way that people behave and the things people do to one another. Oh my goodness. I mean, there's just so much, isn't there?
There's so much. And it almost, that sort of original sin from Agnes's parents, but also Agnes, this scene you were talking about, Laura, where Agnes is basically committing suicide with Shuggie and trying to kill both of them. And it feels almost like Medea. It feels, there are these moments in the book that feel mythological, or they're in this entire other realm, while at the same time, it is not a magical realist book. It's very grounded in realism, but the sort of epic nature of some of it is astonishing.
Maybe that's a useful way for me to read those passages.
This, I feel, has brought us back to, like, why would anyone read this book? But here, some of the comments my book club made. Andy Humphreys, who's always quite tough, I feel, a tough judge of the books that he reads. He gave it 5 stars. He said, I loved it. I really, really loved it. A page-turner. At the end, the tension between the mother and son, the love and tenderness, and the way he spoke differently from everyone else around him. That was just a little thing about him, the way he'd been brought up. He didn't speak with the local vernacular. He spoke properly because that's what Agnes had taught him.
And because he's gay, I think.
Oh, really?
I've read that as also he's...
particular about things and the way he speaks.
Yeah, maybe some of the tones in his voice.
We haven't even talked about it.
No, we haven't, have we?
Yeah.
His sort of, the sense of, there's a sort of otherness about him, isn't there?
Yeah.
There's a quality that does not fit in.
But he can't throw, he can't run. I mean, there's all these things.
He's no right. He's no right.
Exactly.
Guys.
And even Agnes says that.
Yeah. There's a very sweet scene where a girl rescues him from being bullied in the playground and takes him to her caravan that she lives in. and there's a half-drunk dad sitting in the living room. At this point, this will be unsurprising to anyone listening to us talking about this book, but it doesn't give them the glance. And then they go into her room, and it's beautiful, it's immaculate, it's clean, it's tidy, and it's a sort of very precious space that she's made for herself. And it's got all these My Little Ponies on the shelves, and this is the thing he wants to play with more than anything else. And yet, at the end of that, there's a sense that even that innocent pleasure, he knows it's wrong and he feels disgusted with himself, and everything is always so nuanced in this book, like everything that happens.
Oh, that makes me think of Darren McGarvey again. Poverty Safari is the accompaniment to this book. In like the opening chapter, he talks about the language and the vernacular, and he talks about being on the bus in his teens and saying a girl's hair is beautiful. He says it's fucking beautiful because he thinks that will temper his use of beautiful. But of course it doesn't. You do not call things beautiful if you are a Glaswegian young man. Luckily, he doesn't get bullied for it. It turns into like mockery and humor. But there's these codes that I think just go right over our head. But if you're in the community, you have to live and abide by them in order to be accepted.
So Maria in my book club said, for me, the word that really summed it up was brutal, both in the way he describes things and the subject matter. But it's also really well done. I felt it was very consistently good from page 1 to the end. It never slipped into something I didn't believe. I think that's a good point. I think he manages to hold the quality. He kind of lifts you into this story and he never drops the ball. There's never anything that pulls you out of it. So it's interesting because unlike you, Laura, maybe there were times when I wanted to stop, but nonetheless, you keep turning the pages. The writing kept pulling me through. And then, of course, you get to the happy section. Hannah said, I loved his writing. I thought it was so perfectly vivid. It completely transported me. I felt like I was there from beginning to end, and it was very consistent. I loved his use of language. I loved the smattering of Glaswegian dialect we got. It was so perfect. A love letter to his mum. Sally said, I wasn't sure if I would make it through, not because of the writing, but because I was finding it hard going in terms of where it left me emotionally. But because it's so fluently written, I found I did just keep reading. And the ending redeemed it for me. It's a bit like Dory in Finding Nemo. You know that film? Just keep swimming. Just keep swimming. Just keep reading. And then Stuart. Always love his take on everything we read. He said, generally I found it excellent, a real page turner, and I raced through it in 2 days. I thought his writing was amazing. My dad is Scottish, and when I was a kid, I used to read a lot of Scottish comics. So when I read that dialect, it really took me back, and I guess that probably added something for me. He said, but there was something about it at the same time that stops me out and out raving about it, and I think that's because it never really surprised me. I don't think I learned anything from it. And for me, this didn't seem particularly original. As much as I enjoyed reading it, I don't think I'd ever want to read it again. But, he said, I would definitely like to read something else from him. I'd love to see him write about something else.
That is a good comment.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of conventional in lots of ways, isn't it? It's quite a sort of straightforward story. Perhaps we could argue, and I should have taken this up with Stuart at the time, except for that very surprising, incredibly dark moment that Phil and I were talking about earlier. Not wanting to spoil.
I'm going to flip through the pages momentarily.
Not wanting to spoil this incredibly bleak, dark moment for anyone who might be looking forward to it. We can't say what it is. But yeah, I think there were a couple of surprises in there. But ultimately, the arc of the story isn't particularly surprising. Does he leave you in despair, or does it end on a note of hope? I think because, as I said, you know that elements of this are autobiographical, and you know, we didn't know that he'd won the Booker Prize and really arrived in life. But nonetheless, we knew that Douglas Stuart lived in America. He seemed to have a successful career as a fashion designer. The little I knew of him suggested that his life was going quite well. So that then, I suppose, led me to give this optimistic cast at the end, that Shuggie's future will be different and that he will somehow manage to transcend his background. But you don't know, do you?
No, maybe that's just our hope. So a good book club book, if you can get through it.
I think, as I said, I found myself resisting the idea of reading it again. In a way, actually, that I resisted reading it at first. You know, I'm not someone who seeks out books that I know are going to be depressing. But as you said, Phil, within a few pages of starting to reread this, I was completely back into it, and I didn't mind reading it at all. And when you read it, you don't feel depressed, or I don't when I'm reading it. I feel happy because I'm reading something so excellent in every way. You know, it's that kind of pleasure. It's the pleasure you get when you read something that's just really well done. It's art. You're experiencing this art form of writing. And I think this book had that quality that, for me, is the reason I would say to people, don't be scared. Don't be put off. Because ultimately it's a book that's going to enrich you. It really will, I think.
I would also say I read it half in the book and half on audio. And the audio part, I think this is a really good book for that. The language is just so beautiful. And a lot of the humor is actually just in the turns of phrase and the amazing similes that Stuart makes, and the Glaswegian language too. I tend to read sort of zooming through for plot, and the plot is about as bleak as you can get. And therefore, if zooming through for that, I can see how it would be more depressing. But luxuriating through listening to it, and I'm also a sucker for a Scottish accent, I recommend that as a way of reading it.
So I need to slow down.
The one thing I've heard about that, which would only matter to someone from Glasgow, I think, is that apparently the narrator of the audiobook has an East Coast Scottish accent, not a Glasgow accent. And my
That's strange.
friend who is from Glasgow, who had listened to the audiobook, that did bother him.
Understandably.
But that's such a small amount of people are going to be upset by that. I think most, and I don't think actually he minded particularly. It was just something that he noticed. But I've heard the audio is great as well. I think that would be a very good way to encounter this book.
So I need to take it slow and listen to the audio, is what you're saying.
I might mark up the pages for you, the bit I think you need to read.
I'm going to go find it right now. I'm super curious. Maybe I'll end up finishing this book, but I'll read it in weird tranches out of order.
But yeah, no, such a good book. Such a good book club
Absolutely.
book. I hope people pick it up. Based on Shuggie Bain, here are some more recommendations you might like to try for your next book club read.
Well, it will come as no surprise since I've been plugging this book throughout the episode, but I'm going to recommend Poverty Safari, Understanding the Anger of Britain's Underclass by Darren McGarvey. It is a Sunday Times bestseller, and it won the Orwell Prize in 2018. I have to say, I'm slightly obsessed with Darren McGarvey. I just think he writes like no one else. And he sort of explains why in the beginning, in that he's not a reader of books. He grew up thinking books weren't for him and he couldn't focus on them. And yet he's a rapper. And so he was listening to language and then ended up performing it. And so I think that comes through in his writing. He also has such an unusual and valuable insight into working class Glasgow. And not only that, but how well-intentioned or indeed self-serving middle class people will come in and impose their take on what a community needs rather than listening to them. And so this is a very loving portrait of his community and his family, but very practical too. It's quite a practical handbook in terms of assessing your own intentions and assumptions in terms of how you could help or how you could interact with communities different to your own. Razor sharp, fearless, and brutally honest, Poverty Safari is an unforgettable insight into modern Britain. And I completely agree. It would be such a good book club book. I want to make it a book club book. Can we just read it and discuss it?
But you see, I feel like that would be depressing. And so I would generally avoid something like that unless someone like you said you have to read this, or I was doing it for book club.
It isn't depressing. There is a memoir aspect to it. And as I said earlier, his mum passed away at a young age because of her alcoholism. And he grew up surrounded by violence. And he talks about how the prospect of violence is worse than violence itself because there's this dread you carry around with you. When is it going to happen? What's going to happen? And actually, it's almost a relief when violence does happen. It's a relief and it's a release. It opens with him teaching a class in a prison to a group of women prisoners and talks about the statistics around the abuse that they have experienced, why they are there. I think Shuggie Bain is this incredible portrait of an individual family's experience with all the power that comes from fiction. Poverty Safari does get into the statistics and the realities, and I think helpfully the systemic impact of class. And Darren McGarvey talks a lot about class because his accent, you can find him on Instagram actually, his accent defines what other people think of him. Anyway, I really think you should read it. It's really good.
Phil, what are you going to recommend?
I'm going to recommend, and this comes, the more I think about it, the parallels are just crazy. Ocean Vuong's On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. This is a book about a Vietnamese American boy growing up with his mother and grandmother in very dire poverty in Connecticut in the US. It's not a memoir quite, but it's close. It's sort of autofiction. Ocean's relationship with his mother is center stage here. And she, again, is a very not an ideal mother. In this case, quite abusive, which Agnes is not really to Shuggie, but it's a very tortured relationship. And she has gone through her own trauma, which she sort of realizes as the book goes on. It's not just him as a child. It goes into his teenage years. He's also a gay boy and his first boyfriend, who then battles opioid addiction. So it deals with a lot of the same very difficult subject matter. But again, it's an absolutely gorgeous book. Ocean's also a poet, and sometimes, particularly later in the novels, it sort of turns into poetry. But it's incredibly moving, and both of these books just left me in tears. I highly recommend this one.
That sounds great. I really want to read that one. I feel slightly embarrassed that I haven't read it already.
Yeah.
It's been like such a kind of must read, for so long. Do you ever have that thing where it's almost when a book gets so much praise
you resist
and
it.
hype? I'm like, I want to choose to read books because I want to read them, not because I feel like there's like a part of me, but it's so self-defeating. Like, it's ridiculous, this kind of absurd position to take. It's like, well, I'm not going to read that because people say it's great. I was going to recommend a book called The Discomfort of Evening by Marieke Lucas Rijnveld, translated by Michelle Hutchison. It won the Booker International Prize in 2020. It's a family story, another family story. It has a slightly startling opening where you've got this child who's narrating it, this 10-year-old child, and she's talking about how her mother rubs udder ointment onto her to keep out the cold from her skin. You realise quite quickly that this udder ointment, it's meant for a cow. And it's just kind of like, oh, slightly startling. But then you realise, she lives on this dairy farm and her father's a farmer and they have very little money. So everything is always a struggle. And then early on, there is this tragedy. The eldest brother is in an ice skating competition and he does not come back. And it turns out that he has fallen through the ice and died. And so then there's just this tragedy that overhangs their lives. The mother is just sort of destroyed by the loss. But in a way, what's very uncomfortable is the way that the parents take out their devastation on the remaining children, Yas and her younger sister and her older brother, who would have been the middle brother. And it's about how they cope, really. And she's got a kind of strange way of seeing the world. So it's one of those books that has an odd child's eye view perspective. The writing is incredibly good. I say recommend it with little quote marks around it because it is unbelievably bleak. It is an incredibly difficult read, and I found it far harder to read than Shuggie Bain. And I think it is because, unlike Shuggie, there aren't really these moments of lightness or hope, or certainly none that I've come across yet. I haven't quite finished it. And I sort of cite it really because I think it would be a good book club book because it's not that long. It has an extraordinary sense of atmosphere. It's very unique, the perspective of this narrator, and not quite like anything I've read. It's just a kind of emotional gut wrench of a book. But, in terms of depressing books, I just feel it throws Shuggie into the shade, that you would read this and then Shuggie, by comparison, would feel like a light read. And so I felt like it was worth throwing in there, into the mix, that there are more depressing books than Shuggie Bain. And in fact, you don't have to look very hard to find them.
I completely agree with that. I have actually still not made it past 35% of the way through. It is just such a grueling read. And I haven't quite given up on it. I haven't put it on my can't finish shelf. But every time I think about picking it back up, I'm like, no, let me go read something else. It is beautifully written. But
it is.
It's something about, it's also first person, I think, which makes it harder to escape. It's just something about her perspective, more than the scenario, which is bleak, but it's not. There's just something about it which is so visceral and so pungently unpleasant that
And yet, it won the Booker International Prize. Several judges thought it was worthy of being the one book to award the prize to. And I think as a result, it's probably been relatively widely read for a bleak Dutch novel in translation. I'd be intensely curious to see what a book club would make of it. I think it would be quite an interesting discussion.
I think there would be a lot of unfinished books.
That's almost it for this episode.
But if you want to know what a real Glaswegian made of Shuggie Bain, keep listening at the end for a little podcast extra as Laura Thompson from My Book Club gives us her thoughts about the book. Books recommended were Poverty Safari by Darren McGarvey, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong, and The Discomfort of Evening by Marieke Rijnveld.
On our next show, we have an interview with Kate Young, author of the Little Library Cookbooks. These beguiling hardbacks are stuffed both with delicious recipes and read-along literary inspiration. Listen in to find out more. Our next book club discussion will be on The Mermaid of Black Conch by Monique Roffey, a vividly told love story set in the Caribbean. A fishy tale of doomed womanhood, it was the surprise winner of the UK's Costa Book of the Year award.
In the meantime, why not listen to our latest bookshelf episode, where we discuss the books we've been reading outside of book club, the ones we get to pick and choose for ourselves. From the book Laura could barely get through to the most gripping page-turner Kate has read in ages, we've a real range of books to offer you.
If you enjoyed the show, check out our website, thebookclubreview.co.uk, where you'll find our archive of over 80 shows to browse through, including our Booker Prize episode, discussed earlier in the show, as well as a recent book club episode on Writers and Lovers by Lily King and Early Work by Andrew Martin. You can also explore our library of book reviews and articles, including The Lockdown Library, your guide to reading yourself out of a pandemic.
You can also follow us for daily book reviews and recommendations on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or email thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts? If you like what we do, please do take a moment to rate and review the show and help other listeners find us.
But for now, that's our show. Thanks for listening and happy reading.
You wanted my thoughts on how I responded to Shuggie Bain as a Glaswegian, and all I can say is that there are different kinds of Glaswegians, and I would full-heartedly agree that Glasgow is a working class city. I don't really have much knowledge of the kind of experience that Shuggie lives, partly because in the late 70s I actually moved to the south and didn't spend much time in Glasgow. By the time I'd returned in the 80s to go to university, things had changed a bit. I cannot imagine how dreadful it must have been to live out in Pithead. There is a wasteland between Glasgow and Edinburgh, which is just bleak. It's ex-mining communities. It was massively affected by Thatcher's cuts and recession. It's just a heartbreaking place to live. And one of the things about Shuggie Bain that I love is, despite Agnes's dreadful difficulties and challenges, she does remain defiant at great cost. But she does remain defiant, and I understand so much the pull of the city. Glasgow is a magnetic and wonderful place. For me, it's a family story about love and tragedy and resilience and being dealt a difficult hand in life. I think the portrayal of women in Shuggie Bain is phenomenal. The complexities of their life, which seems hidden away from the sort of big gallus men. I hadn't expected a man to write with such intimacy, and he kind of pulled away the gentility and reveals the humour and the horror of the women in the book. I think my favourite scene is quite near the beginning of the book, where the women are all trying on their new bras and Agnes is desperate to get a party going. She's obviously someone who was too big for her own life, and that's just so sad. But I'm so glad that if that was Douglas Stuart's mother's experience, it doesn't seem to have been Douglas Stuart's experience. So that's an amazing thing. Obviously, the last Booker winner was James Kelman in 1994, I think. Now, I'm in a poetry group, and we were all a wee bit snotty about Shuggie Bain at first because it didn't seem to be breaking any new boundaries or particularly innovative in the terms of what it was doing with literature in the way that James Kelman had been entirely amazing and innovative and had kind of broken so many rules. What I have come to realise is that Shuggie Bain is a beautifully written book. It makes you laugh. It certainly made me cry on more than one occasion. I had to put it away several times because I just felt so overwhelmed by it. The books are amazing because they're just so rich in language that I use and my friends and my family use and that we relish. I love the language. It makes me feel cozy and welcome.